California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
The effects today. Cumulative impacts of the federal, state, and local government's racial discrimination and segregation continue to harm African Americans today. In 2019, the median black household earned 61 cents for every dollar earned by the median white household, 544. This is a slight increase from 2016. Households earned 56 cents to the dollar, a figure lower than it had been in 1968, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. 545. The result of their higher unemployment rate and the persistent wage gap, African Americans experience higher levels of poverty. 546 in 2020, 98% of African Americans were living in poverty, compared to 83% of white Americans. 547 due to a combination of racism and sexism. Men have always had a higher rate of poverty than men. 548 12% of white women are impoverished. Compared to 23% of black women. 549 black families are more likely than white families to have family members who are impoverished. 550 This has a destabilizing effect during periods of emergency. A 2020 study found that 36% of white families had enough savings to cover 6 months of expenses. 13% of black families. 551 Another recent survey also found that 36% of black respondents said that they had no money at all set aside for emergencies, compared to 24% of white respondents. 552 Without a safety net. Savings. African Americans can be more vulnerable to upheavals in the labor market and are more likely to experience homelessness. As discussed in Chapter 5, during the COVID-19 pandemic, African Americans were more likely to hold jobs that exposed them to the novel coronavirus. Likely to lose their jobs at the same time they were more likely to see their savings shrink and more likely to not have enough to eat, as was the case after the 2008 recession. They are experiencing the slowest recovery. 553. African Americans have made significant advances into occupations and job categories that used to be subject to explicit segregation, or kept black workers at the margins. There has been a limit to this progress. In 2021, analysis of the 50 most valuable public companies demonstrated that only 8% of C-suite executives, the highest corporate leaders, usually those that report to the chief executive officer, are black. 554 At least 8 companies list no black executives among their leadership team. December 2021, 555 Moreover, much of the gains that African Americans have made in employment and wages have been offset by the intensifying income inequality in the country as a whole. 556. California. Similar for California. In 2019, the Public Policy Institute of California reported that about 17.4% of black Californians were poor or near poor, compared to 12.1% of white people. 557 in 2020. The rate was 14.6% among black Californians and 7.9% among white residents. 558 prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Families in California were nearly twice as likely to be in the bottom tier of income distribution than would be expected for their share of the population. 559 Factors that lead to African Americans often being first to suffer economic downturn and last to recover also persist in California during 19 pandemic. 68% of surveyed black workers in Southern California who had lost their jobs reported that they were still looking for work a year after the start of the pandemic. 560. Americans are also underrepresented in California's two major industries, Hollywood and Silicon Valley. In Hollywood, for example, in films released between 2015 and 2019, black actors were less likely to be in lead roles than white actors. Actors were often funneled into race-related projects, which are typically less well-funded. 561 emerging black actors received 6 leading role opportunities early in their careers. 9 for white actors. 562 black talent is even more underrepresented in positions of creative control. African American directors directed 6% of films released between 2015 and 2019, African American producers produced 6% of those films, and African American screenwriters wrote of those films. 563 in 2020. Los Angeles Times conducted a study of diversity in Hollywood studios and reported that of 230 senior corporate executives, division heads, and other senior leaders in entertainment analyzed by the Times, 10% were African Americans. 564 92% of film industry C-suite executives were white, making the industry more homogeneous than the energy and finance industries. 565 disparities are worse in Silicon Valley. Although between 2004 to 2014, black college students were more likely to major in computer science than white students. 566 A 2018 report revealed that in large tech firms in Silicon Valley, African Americans made up only 4% of all employees. 4% were executives, 5% were managers, and 9% were professionals. 567 report also found that for every black individual who is a direct employee of a tech company, there are 4 black contract workers, who generally earn 75 cents for every dollar made by a direct employee and are far less likely to receive health benefits or paid time off. 568 Conclusion. And was the nation's original disregard for black lives and theft of black labor. Slavery persisted for more than 200 years, and when it formally ended, the nation found new ways, from the black codes to Jim Crow, to keep African Americans tethered to the lowest rungs of work. Discrimination, exclusion, never ceased for more than 150 years. Since the formal end of slavery, African Americans have been denied opportunity and pathways to higher wages and been shunted into the lowest paying, least protected, and oftentimes most dangerous work, or they have been denied work altogether. Instances of affirmative effort to remedy or at least neutralize discrimination were inadequate and short-lived. Severe employment and wage disparities and attendant socioeconomic gaps never closed because the root causes of discrimination, exclusion, were never addressed and have been sanctioned by the government and allowed to persist and entrench. Centuries of government-supported and government-protected racism have produced a labor market that is so solidly and structurally anti-black that it can now stand on its own. It cannot and will not come without an affirmative dismantling and concentrated investment in creating opportunity for full participation by African Americans and full valuation of their work.